This video will compare Hall of Fame running back Floyd Little to non-Hall of Fame running back Larry Brown. I'm really going to be digging into whether or not Larry Brown has Hall of Fame credentials. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button and share it with someone. What type of running back was Larry Brown? Somewhat smallish at 5'11", 195 pounds, about the same size as Floyd Little of the Denver Broncos, but both runners ran like they were much bigger men. Number 44, Richmond Flowers, planted a knee to the back of Brown's neck. A real sweetheart move. Brown was as rugged and tough as they came. He was a very good pass receiver, but took some lumps in that capacity. 1969, Vince Lombardi became the head coach of the Redskins, and he brought future Hall of Fame middle linebacker Sam Huff out of a one-year retirement to anchor his defense. Lombardi spun the Redskins' fortunes completely around. They hadn't had a winning team since the 8-win, 4-loss 1955 squad, yet he turned the 1968 squad that was 5-9 into a 7-win, 5-loss, 2-tie team. Larry Brown was essentially a blocking back at Kansas State. He was drafted in the 8th round by the Redskins in 1969, but Lombardi noticed that Brown was a split second late off the snap of the ball in training camp. It was determined that Brown had a hearing issue, so Lombardi got league approval for Brown to have an earpiece inserted into his helmet that amplified sound. That was a big development as he rushed for a team record 888 yards. Larry Brown played 8 years from 1969 through 1976, while Floyd Little played 9 years from 1967 through 1975. So comparing their statistics offers a high validity factor since they are direct contemporaries. Floyd Little had 6,323 rushing yards and 43 rushing touchdowns, while Larry Brown had 5,875 rushing yards and 35 rushing touchdowns. Little had a 3.9 yards per carry with 54 rushing yards per game, while Brown had 3.8 and 57.6. So far, they are very comparable. Floyd Little led the NFL in rushing yards in 1971 with 1,133, the only year he rushed for more than 1,000 yards. He had years of 979, 901, and 859, only 4 seasons of greater than 800 rushing yards. Brown led the NFC with 1,125 rushing yards in 1970 and should have led the NFL in 1972, but more on that later. Twice he went over 1,000 yards with seasons of 948, 888, and 860 for a total of 5 seasons greater than 800 yards. Slight edge goes to Brown. What do you think about this helmet design? Let me know in the comments. Floyd Little and Larry Brown had very similar receiving numbers, although Brown had 20 touchdowns compared to Little's 9. There's less than 400 yards apart in terms of scrimmage yards, with the edge going to Little, while Brown scored 3 more touchdowns. Basically, these guys are carbon copies of each other, but there's more to address later. In 1970, Vince Lombardi passed away during training camp. Bill Austin took over as the head coach, but the Redskins took a step back with a 6-win, 8-loss season. Enter future Hall of Fame coach George Allen for 1971. Ah, the days when you could tackle a ball carrier 8 yards deep in the end zone after they had crossed the goal line untouched. Larry didn't complain, didn't bother him a bit. Standard fare for 1971. Brown rushed 25 times for 129 tough yards. George Allen's Redskins finished 1971 with a 9-win, 4-loss, 1-tie record, and fans flocked to the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium as they had high expectations for 1972. 1972 team would leave fans standing at attention. Brown tore through the Cardinals for 148 rushing yards and became the Cardinals' all-time leading ground gainer, breaking Don Bossler's mark that took him 8 years to accumulate. It took Brown a hair over 4 years. Check out Larry's perfect block. By the time that 1972 was coming to a close, all the rushing and receiving that Larry Brown did in his first 5 years was beginning to take a toll on him. In 1969, he was third in the NFC in carries, second in 1970, first in 1971, second in 1972, despite George Allen sitting him in the final 2 games in order to rest him for the playoffs, and first again in 1973. Here, Larry sends Pete Athas skyward and tumbling. And here, Larry leaves number 64, John Mendenhall, all 255 pounds of him, writhing in the end zone. Larry ran 23 times for 110 yards. His super blocking back, Charlie Haraway, scored 2 rushing touchdowns in this game. Larry also caught 3 passes for 44 more yards. Brown found yards tough to come by in Philly in Week 12, but he still churned out 102 total yards from scrimmage. Week 13, the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders had good reason to prance around. George Allen was resting Larry Brown for the playoffs. In the playoff game versus the Packers, Larry ran 25 times for 101 yards. 1972 was the second straight season that Larry led the Redskins to the playoffs. Previously, they hadn't been to the playoffs since 1945. He would lead them to the playoffs in 1973 and 1974 too. Although he was a bit player in 1976, that squad went to the playoffs as well. This is one of the primary differences between Floyd Little and Larry Brown. Little never played on a playoff team. Huge edge to Larry Brown. Also, Brown was the NFL's MVP in 1972, and Little was never an MVP. Larry Brown was hit hard when already downed in the end zone. There was no penalty flag and no beef from Brown, which was the way of the day. "1973 was Larry Brown's last quality year. For the first time in his career, he didn't make the Pro Bowl. He was 7th in the NFC in rushing yards with 860, and he had 8 rushing touchdowns. He was still a very capable receiver. His 40 catches were 13th best in the NFC, good for 482 yards and 6 touchdowns. But at the age of 26, he was basically run into the ground and burned out. Week 14 of the 1973 season was Brown's first 100-yard rushing day. Played in snowy, muddy conditions, he had a fantastic day by catching 3 touchdowns and rushing for 1. He had 255 total yards in a sort of a tip of the hat to basically the end of a superb career. After putting the icing on the proverbial mud cake, the Redskins prepared to traverse to Minnesota for the playoffs, where there was a 7-degree wind chill. Larry did some damage in the game by rushing for 115 yards and 1 touchdown. Floyd Little had 5 Pro Bowl seasons and 1 All-Pro season, while Larry Brown had 4 Pro Bowl seasons and 2 All-Pro seasons. As I've noted, they have extremely similar careers for the most part. Only 9 running backs who played in the 1970s are in the Hall of Fame, and Gale Sayers only had 6 carries in the 1970s, so he really doesn't count. I think that the 1970s are underrepresented by running backs in the Hall of Fame, and firmly believe that there is a place for Larry Brown amongst Floyd Little, Larry Csonka, O.J. Simpson, Franco Harris, Walter Payton, John Riggins, Earl Campbell, and Tony Dorsett. What do you think? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching.